Okay, hello everybody. My name is Heather Hamilton and I manage the Norfolk Historic Environment Record. So this afternoon we're here just to have a quick overview about what the Historic Environment Record is, what we do and what resources that we have for undertaking archaeological and historic research in the county. So just as we get started, could I just have a show of hands in the room as to how many of you have heard of the HER before? And those of you online, perhaps you could give a thumbs up. Okay, so quite a few of you are aware of the HER, which is brilliant. And how many of you have used the Norfolk Heritage Explorer website? A few of you, yeah, that's good. And have any of you actually directly accessed our resources before? None of you. Excellent. Oh, a few. Yes. Yes, lovely. So I've interacted. It was probably myself, perhaps one of my colleagues. There's only two of us at the moment who look after the Historic Environment Record for the county. So a few of you I have interacted with. Obviously, I couldn't quite see whether we were getting any thumbs up online, but I'm sure there was probably a reasonable amount. So let's go to the next slide so we can get started. So a brief overview, what is the Historic Environment Record? It sounds like quite a few of you are already aware that we are the definitive record of known archaeological sites and finds in Norfolk. Over the next 45 minutes, I'll be talking quite a bit about what sorts of things the Historic Environment Record includes. But it is a wide breadth of material. We look at everything right from the earliest evidence of human occupation. We are very fortunate in the county to have Haysborough. We do have one of the earliest evidence for the Paleolithic in the country, quite a special site. But we do record all the way into the 20th century. So we do record 20th century military remains. We do record historic buildings, and increasingly there will be selections of buildings into the early 20th century, those that we have identified as particular architectural significance that will become our newest batch of historic structures. But the Historic Environment Record is part of a network across the entire country. There is an HER for every single county. There are also HERs for national parks, and the National Trust has an HER, and we correspond with the National Trust to exchange data between ourselves and all of the individual HERs. And we are overseen by Historic England, and you can actually view information together from all of the HERs on a website called the Heritage Gateway. So there is quite a national network. In Norfolk, we're maintained by the County Council, and our offices are now based here in the Archive Centre. So you will see as we're discussing things that now we share the search room with the Record Office. So if you're coming to view material from the Record Office, you can also contact myself, and you can view material that we hold in our associated archives, which we'll find out as you go along. So you can actually view things at the same time. It's been brilliant. We've been here for 2 years now. And of course, we are open to the public, as I've just hinted at. We do hold archives that you can come and see. So to understand what the HER is, we really need to understand some of its origins. And recording archaeological sites in Norfolk really primarily goes back to this man here, which is Roy Rainbird Clark. And he worked as a correspondent for the Ordnance Survey in the 1930s. So he was going around Norfolk collecting information initially on Roman sites to contribute to the Ordnance Survey maps of Roman Britain, and branching off to other periods as well. But when he was doing this, he started a card index system to record these sites. So on the slide here, we have an example of an Ordnance Survey map, And you can probably just make out, there's lots of scribblings around the edges of that map. Those of you at home might probably be able to see it better on your screens. But there's scribblings around the edges and arrows into locations of where archaeological remains have been found in that area. And each one of those will have its own index card. And they were organized by archaeological period and parish. And so it was his own personal lookup system, reference system of archaeological sites. Really, you can think about it as a bit of a library of archaeological sites in a way. Right, next slide. So he was working for the Ordnance Survey in the 1930s. Really, it was part of a larger conservation movement, which the Norfolk Archaeological Trust was also part of. It was formed in 1926. So there was a lot going on at that time about recording and preserving archaeological sites. And as we know, over the next couple of decades, particularly in the post-war period, there was a lot of development taking place. There was also a lot of development in understanding of archaeological sites in particular. We were developing aerial photography following the war. There were great advancements. We were becoming aware of lots of earthwork sites. We were also becoming aware that they were being destroyed. And particularly by the time we got to the 1960s, there was a lot of rescue archaeology going on across the entire country. Archaeology was becoming much more embedded as an idea and about finding information for the past. It was becoming much growing awareness, and archaeologists were crying out that sites were being destroyed by developers. And by 1975, this was starting to solidify a little bit. And we had already at that point been starting to record historic buildings. It was in the 1960s that most of the initial listed building surveys and assessments were being developed. So there's some national awareness. We'd had scheduled monuments for quite some time, but there were a lot of other sites being missed that were being destroyed. And it was decided that they really needed an evidence base to know about what sites were in existence. You know, where were these archaeological sites? We needed a reference as to where they were as a first port of call to then bring attention to their importance and get them recognized in the planning system. So the turning point was 1990. In 1990, there was Planning Policy Guidance 16 issued, and it made archaeology a consideration in the planning process. So that was a real turning point. HERs, I didn't realize I slightly skipped over. It was 1975 that all the HERs were starting to be formed. The Norfolk HER was amongst the earliest in the country to be formed. And it was based on the record card system that Roy Rainbird Clark created, because he had become the curator of the Norwich Castle Museum. And he brought his index card system with him. So in the 1960s, and particularly the 1950s, 1960s, when all this development was going on, his index card system was at the museum. They were encouraging lots of things to be recorded. Rainbird Clark was really instrumental in encouraging archaeological objects to be brought into the museum and liaising with the people out in the countryside to record archaeological remains. And he added to his card system. So in 1975, when the historic environment records were starting to be formed, it was his index system that formed the basis of it. His index cards were renumbered, and that information became the basis of the HER. Right, I got excited and ahead of myself because I knew we had lots to cover. So jump ahead to 1990. Now, archaeology is fully part of the planning system. And historic environment records, they've been around for a while now within counties as an information base, and they became the evidence base for everything that goes on within the planning system in regards to archaeology. So in Norfolk, we have a small team of archaeological planners who look at things that go through the planning system. They look at what information we have on the HER, and they decide if we need some investigation before any piece of land can be developed. They're looking at the impact to the archaeological sites and deciding whether any recording needs to be done in order to allow development to proceed. So that's really the context in which historic environment records exist. But of course, as they've grown, they've become much more than that. They're widely used by academics, by students, by local societies, anyone with an interest in researching archaeology and historic buildings. The resource is there, it's widely used. In terms of the record itself, it started off on index cards like our other slide. But by the year 2000s, everything was becoming digitized, and we had digital mapping for the first time. Because the historic environment record, you'll have seen from that map and the index cards, it's really geographically based. It's a geographic collection of information. And we became digital. And in 2007, we went online with the Norfolk Heritage Explorer. So many of you have seen that resource, making it much more widely available. We do receive contact from researchers all over the world, looking at researching Norfolk's past, and they are able to access the Norfolk Heritage Explorer. And the next big milestone for us, it was in November 2023. Because the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act came into being, it was approved. And in that act, it makes having a historic environment record a statutory obligation. So it is now fully embedded in the planning process that all relevant authorities must maintain a historic environment record to be used as the evidence base for that process. Right, next slide. So today, the historic environment record is part of a wide suite of services in the county that deal with managing archaeology and heritage. So we have the historic environment record at the top here. And to the right, I've already mentioned our archaeological planning service. So they provide advice to planners and those managing the countryside. But we also have a find identification team that works with the Portable Antiquities Scheme. So they're there to record any stray objects that are found by metal detectorists, field walkers, anyone. If you happen to find an archaeological object, you can contact our finds team. They'll identify it for you, and that information is incorporated into the historic environment record. And we also have an air photo interpretation team. They work on funded projects, analysing aerial photography and LiDAR imagery from the county. So I will talk more about that as we go on. And this is what the digital version of the HER looks like today. This is what we see and what we work with. There's a lot to it. There's a lot of elements. It's quite complex, but also quite powerful for research. We do spend a lot of time working with professionals, PhD students, people doing their dissertations, because we can do quite bespoke searches of the database to provide raw data for use in research. Next slide. To simplify it a little bit, this is a model of how we actually organize the information that appears in this digital database. Monuments are what most of you will interact with. The term monument isn't brilliant. It's a legacy, really, of how these records developed and terminology that's been used. But the term monument really just means site. Archaeological site, archaeological remains. So monuments are the actual physical remains that we're recording, and they're the main records that you can see on the Heritage Explorer. As part of that, underneath it, of course, we have the sources of information that we've used to compile these database records. And we also record by events. So these are activities that have taken place. They're generally investigative events. So every time someone goes out, does a bit of field walking, might do a little bit of test pitting as part of an evaluation process. They might do some excavation. They might do a geophysical survey to learn more about the area. That's an event. And that information sits a little bit more behind the scenes, but is used by professional researchers. So next slide, please. This is what most of you will have interacted with so far. So this probably looks familiar by the show of hands. A lot of you have seen it before, the Norfolk Heritage Explorer website. And there are a variety of different ways that you can search the database. Really, you can picture the database records as being like those index cards, picking out where sites are in the county and what we know about them. There are several different ways to search. We've got a simple search, which I've just put at the top here. We can search by keyword, by archaeological period. And if you know the reference number for the site, if you've been looking at it before and you've jotted it down, you can enter that. That's what the NHER number, which stands for Norfolk Historic Environment Record. You can search directly by that if you've jotted it down. But we also have an advanced search, which searches a lot of the wider indexing that's used across the database. So that's really powerful. Maybe you have an interest in pillboxes. So you can go to site type and select pillbox from the list. It is a managed index list, so it's not free text. You need to find what terms we use from the index. And you could pull up all of our records that we have for pillboxes in the county, and you can have it show it to you where they are on the map as well. So once you bring up your search, there will be a show on map, and you can go and look at that. And just an example of what the map search looks like. Now, the technology that was used in 2007 is quite outdated now. I am due for a revamp. Hopefully in the next 2 years, I'm going to be launching a new version of the Norfolk Heritage Explorer. This map search, I often get a lot of queries about it. I have a little package at the back of the room that you can pick up at the end with some little instructions for how to use it. And the most frequently asked question I get is, you can see the objects there relating to archaeological sites in the landscape, and you want to find out the information to them and get the link. To do that, there's a little toolbar in the top right hand corner, and there's one that's a little bubble and has an eye in it. You need to select that, and the green box will appear around it, and then click on the object and you will get the information that's coming up on the screen at the moment. Then you'll get that wider bubble and you will get a link to the record where you can view the details and find out what that is. That is one of the most frequently asked questions we get about using the map search. So very quickly, I thought it would be useful to actually go through some of the parts of the records and what you actually see. Because when you're looking at one of our database records, it's probably useful to picture in your mind a library index card, because that's really what they're intended for. They're intended to signpost to where there is more information about the sites and just show a brief summary about what we know about that area. So as an example, this is the record that you would see on the Heritage Explorer for Middleton Mount, which is currently managed by the Norfolk Archaeological Trust. And you can see right at the very top, you can show it on the map, which I'll look at in a minute. It's right on the top above the record details. Hopefully, all of you have found that. But the very first thing is the NHER number. So if you are looking at a record on the Heritage Explorer, you might have a question about it, jot down that reference number, because the quickest way for us to get to it and help your inquiry is to say, oh, I've been looking at NHER 3394. This is my question. This is what I'd like to look at. And that makes it really, really quick and easy for us to get to it. And also you would then be able to easily get back to it yourself if you do want to look at it again later. The other thing worth just pulling attention to, this isn't quite in the order that you'd see it. There is a lot of information on the record that you do have to keep scrolling down to see it all. Most of you who've used it have probably discovered this already. There's quite a lot of information compiled. The lists on the right are some of the other sections that you would come across. And the monument types, those are types of archaeological features or historic structures that will appear there. And those are examples of the index terms that are used to search within the database. So they're not necessarily completely comprehensive, because we're picking out the highlighted things, the most important things about that site that people might want to search by to look things up. So if you were searching in the advanced search, you could search for all Motte and Bailey castles, and you can see all the sites within the county that are indexed as Motte and Bailey castles, for example. Similarly, the finds, we've got types of objects and archaeological time periods against those objects. And so you can search individually for those as well. But those lists are index and searching terms that are used. Yes, next slide. The main bit of the records, as you might see them, you can see we have a full description and we have a list of sources for those records. Now, the descriptions are going to be organized by time and event. So there will be a separate entry for each time someone might have found an object and reported it, or someone might have gone out and just done a little visit of the site, made some observations about the nature of any earthworks or remains that are there. It might be that someone's done some desk-based research and has found out a little bit more about the site. And so each of those will be listed in chronological order, moving down that description. And it will be linked to the source of information that came from. So hopefully those of you that have explored the record before, you will see under each entry, so that there were some excavations in 1987. That's the second one down on the screen. And you can see at the end of it, we've got a couple of reference. We've got S3 and S17, and those refer to the numbered sources in the list at the end of the record. So S3 is a journal article that was written by Trevor Ashwin that appears in Norfolk Archaeology. So that's a publicly accessible journal. S17 is an unpublished contractor report. So S17, that is going to be a report that was probably done up within part of the planning system and isn't actually published anywhere. But that report is what we're the repository for. So anything that shows up in that source list as an unpublished document, that's likely something that either we hold in our archives, or we might be able to point you towards where it is. Yeah. So that's one of the big things to look at. Okay. So enough of that. And of course, that's just the map object, of course. Right, so I've waffled on about that for a little while. I sort of added that into my normal presentation because having done this a little while, I used to spend a lot more time just about the breadth of what we record, which is brilliant. But I felt like I get a lot of questions about the Heritage Explorer and about how the information is actually stored. So hopefully that helped a little bit in providing a little bit more guidance as to what you see. For those of you that haven't interacted with the HER yet, that might have been a bit preemptive. Let's actually look at now what breadth of things we record in the HER. I mentioned already that it's everything from the Paleolithic right up into the early 20th century, and even Cold War sites. But let's look at some categories. One that you probably would occur to you right away are nationally designated sites. So these are your scheduled monuments, which receive the highest level of protection, listed buildings, registered parks and gardens. There are also registered battle sites, but we don't happen to have any in Norfolk, and protected wrecks. And none of our wrecks are actually protected in Norfolk, but we don't actually have any. But that category is probably familiar with for you, and you can see wide breadth of things. We've got some archaeological earthworks at St. Benet's Abbey. We've got listed structures. I've got Sheringham Park down there. Milestones, a selection of our milestones are listed. And we have the RAF Coltishall blast walls, which are also listed and protected. Buried archaeological remains. That's quite obvious from everything that I've said so far. That is really that was the first emphasis of the Historic Environment Record, but it does go right from the very earliest discoveries. So we have Sir Thomas Brown here. That's our earliest event in the record, is a discovery of some Saxon urns in the 18th century. So our events start right from the 18th century, and of course right up towards modern excavation. Historic buildings and landscapes. So the historic buildings that we record, they do include much more than just those ones that are nationally listed. We do include quite a wide variety. I have an example here of a Methodist chapel, as one of the buildings that is on the record. But it is incomplete. There's still quite a lot of work to do, really, for assessing historic buildings in the county and getting more information in the Historic Environment Record. So you might be looking at an area and think, oh, why is this building on the Historic Environment Record and not this one? And it's simply because no one's done the survey work yet. There hasn't been a broad brush survey to say, oh, actually, this is of importance and it should be on the record. Particularly 19th and early 20th century buildings. And we do record things from historic maps as well. So I already mentioned parks and gardens and other landscape features. Sometimes when you go to a record, the only information might be that it was recorded from the first edition Ordnance Survey map, for example, or it's something that appears on the tithe map. And that might be our only information so far. And quite frequently, we do have lots of interaction with those of you going and researching other types of documents who can bring back information for us, and we can link more resources to those records and fill out more information. Maritime sites. I'd already referenced them a little bit. This is the wreck of the Vicuna, which was an ice ship that was recorded by the Maritime Archaeological Trust a little while ago. And of course, the iconic Sea Henge, which is in King's Lynn Museum. So we do record everything in the intertidal zone. 20th century military remains. I've already referenced that quite a bit. We do have increasing information on World War I, World War II sites. There's a lot of activity in gathering information about these. So that is an area of receiving a lot of development and something that we could do with lots more coming through. Just some examples, we've got our airfield at Rackheath, We've got the Pullham airship base, which is in the photo on the right. This is a post-war photo where actually they're dismantling airplanes. You can see beside the building, they're actually dismantling bits. And we have some examples of some trenches at Sheringham, part of the Sheringham beach defences there. Artifacts from the plough soil. This is quite a large category of information within Norfolk. We have a lot of very active metal detecting groups in the county, and this is a hobby that is becoming increasingly popular. And we do still have our own find identification and recording team. And so all of that information goes via them and comes to ourselves in the Historic Environment Record. They record over 10,000 objects every single year, and we collate that information. Crop marks and earthworks are also a really important piece of evidence for us. So this is an example of a crop mark site. And it is a little Iron Age farmstead. So I mentioned we have a team of air photo interpreters, and this is what they've drawn of what they've seen in photographs in the surrounding area, compiling them of the crop marks and earthworks. The green are ditches and the red are earthworks. And we can see we've got a lovely square Iron Age settlement in the middle. That's where it's got red earthworks to defend it. We've got a couple of round houses in the middle. And then we have quite an extensive field system around it. So that's just an example of some of the information that we can pull out of aerial photographs. And I just threw this one in as a lovely example of how much evidence there actually is in the rural landscape in Norfolk. It's really incredible. This is the environs of Caister Roman town. So in the middle, you can see Caister itself with its network of roads, the red in the middle. And around it, you can see the amount of activity that we've recorded. That will be representative of all sorts of different archaeological periods. So it will be prehistoric sites. There'll be some mixed in there. Obviously, a lot of Roman activity, Saxon activity in the area that surrounded Caister Roman town. And I've hinted already at where we get our information from. So one of the main sources is excavations and surveys. And the vast majority of archaeological work that's undertaken in the county is done through archaeologists working under the planning system. That is the context in which most archaeological excavation is undertaken. Obviously, there are still academic activities. We do have a really good number of active community groups who do undertake excavation in the county, so they do send information to us. And so those of us looking after the Historic Environment Record, we do keep our eye on all of the local academic journals. We keep in touch with all of the community groups doing work in the county. We also, where we can, get work to look at other historic documents and wider photographs as well. But you see, we do get information from a lot of you, people such as yourselves who have an interest, who might be going out doing your own research, sending some information to us. Lovely. And now the other big category, thing that I haven't talked about yet, is what sits under this database. So database is the core, really, it's an index system. But unusually, in Norfolk, we have 3 quite extensive archives that sit underneath it, 3 resources. The primary resource, actually could have the next slide. The primary resource is the NHER archives, which I've already hinted at. The vast majority of the information in those archives are the unpublished reports that go through the planning system. Quite often these reports are original work that, if it's a really important site, might be published in a journal later on. It might be digested and put in a large monograph if it's a really big site. But those initial reports, we are the repository for those. So that's one of the resources that you can come in and look at, as well as information gathered by our find recording team. So a large number of finds, illustrations, photographs, object descriptions, they form all part of our archive. As well as some short unpublished reports done by other groups, such as the Norfolk Historic Buildings group. They quite often go and do surveys of historic structures, and so they send us in copies of their reports so that they can be more widely accessed and used. So there are quite a lot of small unpublished reports on surveys of historic buildings or archaeological surveys. It might be a little bit of field walking that was undertaken. In some instances, there's photos taken during those investigations, so we do hold a small number of those as well. But what we hold is all about the activities that are undertaken to investigate sites. We don't hold any objects. Those are held by the Museum Service. We hold the unpublished reports. The second resource that we have is a reference library. And this really grew up as a resource for the Historic Environment Service itself. It was a resource compiled from 1975 to the present. It will include the major county archaeological journals, as well as some copies of local publications. It does also include a lot of references used by archaeological professionals. You can see there's a book on Rome in Britain just featured there. So a lot of them will be about archaeological process, but it is quite a useful resource. Next one. And last, but very much not least, we do also house the Norfolk Air Photography Library. This is a particularly special collection. We have well over 90,000 images, and it includes a variety of both vertical and oblique images of the county. It is one of the most used resources. It is the thing that's most consulted here. This is just an example of one of our vertical collections in Norwich. We have almost complete coverage taken by the RAF in 1946 as part of the National Air Survey. We have complete coverage taken in 1988 that are some color images, and we do have some selected Ordnance Survey vertical images. The next slide. We do also have 40,000 images that were taken by photographer Derek Edwards when he worked for our Historic Environment Service between 1975 and the year 2000. And these are specifically focused on archaeological sites. So he went out every single year for 25 years in the summers, and he'd be flying, he would choose areas to fly over, and he'd be looking for crop marks and earthworks. So just an example, of course, I've got St. Bennett's there, and we've got an excavation in process at Thetford, and we've got Grimes graves from the air there. And we do have a couple special collections within the Air Photo Library. We have a small number of images taken by the Royal Flying Corps, dating from 1915 to 1917 is the dates of the photos that we have. And it's a mixture. You can see there is some ephemera that we wouldn't normally collect, but it was part of collections that we received together. But there are a lot of actual aerial images taken by the Royal Flying Corps. We do also hold images from the Norfolk and Norwich Aero Club. It was formed at the Mousehold Aerodrome in 1927. So it was around the time that aerophotography was still very pioneering, and we had quite an interested group that formed the club at the aerodrome. And it does include archaeological sites. We've got Horsford Motte and Bailey Castle there. And so these images all date from 1927 into the 1930s. Really, really unique early examples. And we do also hold the aerial images from the George Swain collection. So the aerial images we hold copies of. The George Swain collection, it does include many other things, and those are held by the Heritage Centre at the Forum. But this is George Swain's shop and some images of Norwich, including Kelly's factory that has been redeveloped recently. So I've said a little bit about what services we provide. Most of our data is accessible online on the Norfolk Heritage Explorer website. There is a small amount of information that isn't made public on that site. There's some more specific information about events, which is held back, and also particularly the locations of sensitive metal detecting sites is not made available on the Norfolk Heritage Explorer. So if you're particularly researching objects, come directly to us, because the other service that we provide is bespoke searches of the database. So it might be a geographic area, it might be an archaeological period, it might be a specific type of site, but we can help to design a search to pull back information that will help you explore whatever you're interested in. And we will provide a PDF copy of the full written records. So it will include some information that doesn't go online and a PDF map as well. For any of you who do use digital mapping, we can provide that mapping in digital format as well. So we can provide it in a format that you can use in Google Earth, for example, to overlay it in the landscape. Our archives are also available to consult. Some of our material is available digitally, but some of it is only in physical form, such as the aerial photographs. So if you want to look at aerial photographs for an area, email us, set up an appointment for us to prepare those for you, and you can view them in the search room here. And I think that mostly repeats what I've just said. So I knew that I was going to be tight on time to get through that, but I've just about managed it. So this is us with our contact details. You can reach us at heritage@norfolk, heritage.gov.uk.